So thank you very much, and thanks to Judy for inviting me to this panel. I am, having heard reports of the last panel, I'm sorry that I missed it, because I'm sure, for one thing, that much of what we'll say will be either a reputation or perhaps a direct contradiction to what you heard in the last panel, so this should be interesting. A couple of potentially relevant pieces of information to help explain my perspective. One is that I have been here since 2002, so 11 years. I went all the way through the ladder at Harvard. Harvard was my first job. Also, I have a 3-year-old daughter, which was a post-tenure innovation, but I have that perspective on work-life balance. I have been tenured for 4 years now. I haven't had a lot of opportunity to see the way the process works from the other side. I haven't sat on a lot of tenure committees, so most of whatever I can offer you today comes from my own individual experience going through this process at Harvard. Two main things that I would like to get across as general pieces of advice, some of which were given to me at the early stages of my career that were very helpful. My first would simply be that no one is, in terms of getting through the tenure process, no one is more fundamentally invested in your career navigation than you are. So while you need to take advantage of all of the many mentoring opportunities you have here, and while there are many people who will be intervening in your career and saying, here's something you should do, let's meet and talk about your tenure track, your life on the tenure track, you need to be proactive about going out and finding out about what you need to do, what's the best way to get through the process. When I was coming up for tenure or about to come up for tenure, I just reached out and made an appointment with the assistant dean of FAS and sat down and asked whether I was perhaps missing something from my conversations with my chair, whether there was something else I needed to know. And that was an extremely helpful meeting to have, because I wasn't actually getting the full picture from all of the different constellations of mentors that I had. And no matter how well-intentioned your mentors are, they are extremely busy and they may miss something. So I feel that it's important that you take responsibility for your movement through the tenure track and really look for mentoring. Don't always wait for it to come to you. My second and much larger point is simply that you need to know your limits and respect them. Part of respecting your limits, of course, is understanding that you can't do everything. And that's something that's a lot easier to understand in principle than it is to actually acknowledge in practice, because, of course, we're all perfectionists and we're all really excited about being here and want to get involved in as much as we possibly can. But I think that teaching at and just being at Harvard entails being constantly confronted with a surplus of opportunities. The difficult thing is recognizing that you can't take them all, and some of them are going to have to be unexplored. You're always going to need to be making decisions about whether to teach a new course, take on a new graduate student, accept this or that invitation to go give a lecture somewhere, edit an anthology, write a book review, be a member of a particular kind of a committee. Very quickly you'll see that you have many more offers in front of you than you can possibly take up. And all of them, even the committees, are likely going to be really exciting opportunities and things that you would be really intellectually interested in. But you will have to make decisions about which of these opportunities to follow through with. And there will be no wiggle room in your schedule. You're going to need to confront the reality that every time you take on a project, some other project is going to have to be sacrificed. Something else will have to be sacrificed. And that's not going to be just the time you would have spent sitting in front of the television. There's very little of that, as anyone who teaches at Harvard knows. You're going to have to sacrifice either some other project or your family or your health or sleep. From listening to me, you can probably determine that health and sleep are currently my pet sacrifices. But the fundamental point that I would like to make is that, and something that I wish I had done better from the outset, was to develop a sense of your priorities so that when you're confronted with these constant decisions about what to do next, what kind of opportunity to take advantage of, you have some modicum of a sense of purpose and control to the way you move through your academic career, because it's very easy to have your academic career shaped entirely by external forces, by the fact that someone just happened to offer you, to ask you to write a chapter for this or that anthology, and suddenly you can get pulled down an intellectual or academic path that might ultimately be very productive, but you need to be able to ask yourself, is this where I want to be going with my thinking and with my work? And to be able to have a sense of what your priorities are as you do that. I thought what I would do for the rest of my time is talk about a few of the decisions that I made while going through this process. They were difficult decisions. They turned out to be the right decisions. I don't know if it's because they were necessarily, terribly intelligent at the time. Maybe it was just luck, but they did turn out to be the right decisions. Many of you will probably face similar kinds of decisions or, forks in the road as you go through the process. So my very first year here, for example, I really decided that I needed to finish the manuscript for my first book. I came here out of a 2-year postdoc where I had made a lot of progress on the manuscript, but I realized it was within my power to finish the manuscript my first year here, but in order to do that, I would have to become essentially a social recluse. And I decided to go ahead and do that, to be a social recluse in order to get my manuscript done right away. I knew, of course, that I needed to develop these incredibly important social relationships with the members of my department. And of course, I wanted to have these social relationships with the members of my department. I wanted to, go to all of these receptions in the evening and go to dinner parties. But I also knew that if I really wanted to finish the manuscript, I would have to devote virtually every scrap of spare time that I had to doing it in a really single-minded way. My reasoning was that once the manuscript was in, once I had managed to do that in a single year, I would then be able to revert to my normal level of social behavior, and that I could overcome that initial deficit and become closer to the members of my department. But I felt that it would actually be harder to recover from a slow start in the area of publishing. And my chair actually later told me that, in fact, people had noticed that I wasn't participating in departmental events to the level that I should have. He said, we all thought you were just this little mouse that went back to your office all the time. And so it definitely was noticed, but I was there the next year and the next year, and I did my social, I became more of a part of the department. And that first year just became this aberration. But on the other hand, then when I went through my first promotion reviews and the first points where I was being evaluated, I had my book done, not only as a manuscript, but it was a book between covers. It had already been started to be reviewed. And that was really important, at least for me, in terms of being able to develop the confidence of my department and the field around me. And for me, the essential lesson there is just the importance of getting your work out early, so that as you're going through these various promotion reviews, you have already established a position in the field and also begun to have responses to your work out in the broader field. So much of what you have to think about is the pacing of certain kinds of efforts as you go through your life in the department and in your field. The second decision I made was with respect to teaching, and I decided very early on that despite the fact that there were a million different courses that I wanted to teach, I was really excited to begin teaching. There were all these topics I wanted to explore. I decided that I would instead try to cultivate and repeat a relatively small number of courses rather than developing a whole array of new courses every semester. This gave me more time to put my intellectual energy into research and writing when I needed to do that. As most of you already know, developing a new syllabus takes an enormous amount of time and effort. And especially in the early stages of your career, I think that that's not always the best way to use your teaching time and your teaching energies, because there are a lot of arguments to be made actually from a pedagogical point of view for repeating a course every year or every other year, because you can spend your teaching efforts then perfecting that course and developing it in both depth and range, rather than constantly being pulled off into new directions and developing new courses, which, let's face it, they're always just first drafts the first time you teach them. And incidentally, repeating a course at Harvard is a very good way to increase the enrollments in your courses, because the students here are very heavily dependent on Q guide evaluations and word of mouth about courses that already exist. The first time you teach a course, you will often get a much lower enrollment than you would the second time, simply because students have heard about the course. And because of that, repeating a course helps you demonstrate your worth as part of the teaching staff in your department. It helps you to become something of a fixture in departmental culture if there are students that are expecting you to teach whatever course it is from year to year. So for me, I think it was really important to develop a manageable and perfectible course portfolio, rather than following every possible intellectual interest in the form of new courses. Finally, another decision that I had to make, which was unexpected and probably the most difficult one as I went through my first few years of teaching, had to do with publishing and making decisions about what kind of publications I wanted to devote my time to. After my first book was published, I was asked to contribute several chapters to a new textbook in my field that was being written by 3 prominent senior academics in the field. And I was eventually actually asked to be one of the co-authors of this textbook. And of course, this sounds like obviously a terrific opportunity, and of course I wanted to leap right on it. But I did also know that agreeing to this would mean that my second book was going to be delayed, and it turns out that it actually was delayed by 1 to 2 years because of this. A textbook sounds great, but when it comes to getting through the tenure process, it's not a single authored piece of original research. So it counts for almost nothing, really, in the actual, when the rubber actually hits the road in those tenure meetings. It's the original single authored books, at least in my field, in the humanities, that are going to matter. So I knew that it would be a really big risk to take this on. But I actually decided finally, after consulting with my chair, that I would go ahead and do it, because of the various kinds of extracurricular academic projects that one could sign up for, I felt that this was worth the risk, because first of all, having your name on the front cover of a major textbook in your field obviously gives you a certain air of authority that some other kinds of anthologies or other kinds of publications may not. That was worthwhile. And also I obviously got to know these 3 co-authors very well, these 3 very important senior people in the field. I don't know, but I assume that they were all asked to write for me in the tenure process. I assume and hope that they were positive letters. But it was a really nice, the point being that this was the kind of extracurricular project that helped me with thinking about my relationship to the rest of the field, making my work known to people at the senior levels in the field. So it was a risk, but I felt that it was a risk worth taking. It did mean that it basically consumed 2 summers, which is to say 2 years of my research and writing time. It meant that my second book was not finished when I went up for tenure. But obviously in the long run, it must have been okay. But again, the point here is just that often these kinds of activities where you need to raise your profile to the senior faculty in the field, people around the world who are working on the kind of material that you're working on, sometimes that can be done in ways other than simply in your own research. So that's another thing that you constantly have to weigh. I think my time is probably up, so I'll pass over to Francesca.
Well, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed the first panel, and I was thinking that after listening to Amy talking about their approach to social comparison, I will definitely call her up to mentor me next time I'm getting into this social comparison. So, yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, being in this situation, and also we looked at each other, it's like, well, they think that we have figured it out. I don't think we do. We kind of, you know, try to go day by day. But I just want to share with you something a little different, and something that I used, you know, it really worked for me, and it will sound a little too strong, but it worked for me. So, and also worked for our provost. So I'm sure I'm getting your attention. I think that, you know, the analogy, and actually cannot even be an analogy, it might be very serious, is that start training for a marathon and run a marathon. Because there is a lot of the mental skill that you need to be successful, and not only to get tenure, but to be successful in our academic career, are mental skills that long-distance runners have. And so there's been mentioned during the day many of these teams, and actually it was funny that I feel that if you just Google the 10 tips for the long-distance runner, and you should try to do that at the end of the day, and I think it'll capture the 90% of the main points that have been made today. Because so first of all, it's about endurance. And, you know, it is an endurance, it's a mental toughness and endurance game. It's a beautiful endurance game, and something that, you know, you have to be passionate about it, because you are here because you are passionate. But it's about enduring, and it's about finishing, it's about having a vision, it's about having a long-term goal, it's about pacing yourself, it's about being resilient, is about bouncing back when you get injured, and it's about being competitive, and it's about finishing the race and basically accomplishing, having this greatest sense of accomplishment. And you want to pace yourself, and you want to train yourself so well that when you have finished the race, you will be very happy to run another 10, because after you get the tenure, you have 10 or 15, another 20 marathons to go. So this was, like, to me, the way that I feel I could capture, and, you know, in a good way. I mean, you know, in terms that really going out every day and training for your marathon and try to improve yourself toward your goal, it's something which is really beautiful, and is very similar of going to work every single day and try to perceive your goals and train yourself a little bit at a time. And sometimes it feels like, you know, you are mile 26 and you're really tired and you want to quit, and teaching yourself, no, because, you know, you're almost there. So just Google the top tip, the 10 tips for a successful long-distance runner. Read it through, and you will let me know if I didn't nicely summarize, I think, most of the conversation we had today. So just, you know, other thought. I think it's important to be a finisher, to finish what you have started. Sometimes the project that you start that, you know, you're really, really excited, and then doesn't turn out as you want it. And again, you have this really pressure to quit. Never quit, finish it. It might be not the best project, that's fine. It's important to file it up, and then, you know, really say, okay, I close this circle and this project is done, and move on something else. I think that, you know, the other thing that was mentioned, I think this is a place where, you know, you should not be shy. Don't be shy. Ask information. Don't waste your energy thinking about, I should have done this, I should have done that, they're expecting me this, just ask. And I think that, it's interesting to me because I love when people come to me and ask for advice. I feel really great. And so just go and ask. I mean, I'm sure not everybody's like that, but people really appreciate if you ask advice, or even you want to have a chat, or even you want to have some type of validation that whatever is your mind is. And don't waste your time struggling about what this person thinks or what this person does. You know, just ask and just get clarity and really move on. One thing that, you know, again, that really happened to me often. I remember having meeting with my, with my mentor. And that's why also I think the analogy for marathon runner really applied to me very well. I remember the most common advice was, pace yourself, don't burn out. This is going to be a 40 years career. You can't do everything, you know, in the first 3 years of your work. So at that time, what I was doing with them, I will actually, when I would go to his office, I will literally go on the blackboard and write down all the projects I was working on it. And I say, so what do you think? Should I do this first, or that first? He said, okay, yeah, I think you should do this first, and then this other first. And then, again, in the same way as running, I will think, okay, what are the hours of the day that for me are most productive? And that will be the hours where I will focus on the project that I think were more important. And then after I had my 2 or 3 hours, 4 hours, so that I made my progress on that, then I'm much more happy and open and willing to, you know, get involved in other projects. So I think choosing your mentors carefully and rely on them, I think it can be extremely useful. And I think that this is a really an incredible environment where, you know, could be mentors in your own group, in your own school, or even outside the school. And I think that really has been extremely helpful to me. So in terms of work-life balance, and I know this has been come up in a few situations, and I found, you know, I've been invited a few times to think about work-family balance, and it is challenging. And so I think that, I think Felix made a point, which I really share with him, is outsource. And so I think that, you know, I don't do laundry, I don't do grocery shopping, I don't clean my house. I mean, I think constantly, and, you know, my spouse is also in academia, I mean, I think about this, is this really worth it on my time? Or, you know, in the same way you want to hire a lab manager, do I want to spend my weekend thinking about grocery shopping or fixing my car? No, I outsource everything. So then I either work, or I'm having fun, I do my running, I spend the time with my daughter. So I don't really get bogged down on things so that I can hire somebody to do. I think, you know, I can talk forever, but I don't think, well, I mean, I think the other thing that in this type of setting, I don't know, I mean, I remember being exactly, you know, in this thing, in your own shoes and participating in this workshop, and at the end of the day, I will feel so overwhelmed. And, you know, and so I think that the message I want to try to send as much as I can, a positive message. I mean, I think that you have probably, you know, the most prestigious and wonderful job that you can possibly have. I mean, you know, you have your career in learning new things in an environment which has expertise across all fields. Just enjoy it. Just really enjoy it. Take it, you know, bring your skill to the next level. And again, buy a book that's called How to Be a Marathon Runner. And even if you don't run a marathon, I can assure you that's going to help. That's all I'm going to say. That's it.
Thank you. That was wonderful. When Judy asked me to come to this, I was thinking about, you know, what I would say. And so what I'm going to talk about are the things that I know now that I didn't know when I was an assistant professor. But to put that into context, I have to tell you, when I came here, I was absolutely terrified of coming here. I had been told by my advisor to view my job as an assistant professor as essentially being an overpaid postdoc. He said, you know, Harvard will can you quickly, but, you know, just go there and learn as much as you can, be a sponge. And I was like, okay, this is not good for my ego. Anyhow, so I also came from a different world. I'd gone to graduate school at the University of Kentucky, which is you know, it just doesn't have the intensity of an institution like this or an institution like Stanford or Princeton. So I felt, and I still do, I felt like a complete imposter. I felt as an assistant professor that it was only a question of time before the dean called me up and said, you know, gee, there's been a huge hiring mistake. And even when I got tenure, even today, there are days when I sit here talking to you and, you know, I can kind of, in my brain, see Alan Garber walking in saying, you know, actually, that ad hoc we held for you in 2009, you know, we were considering you. You were meant to be the computer support, not a tenured professor. So I was terrified. I continue to be terrified. But what I've learned over time is we're all terrified. And the institution has... What makes us so successful is that we're terrified. So we work really hard to make sure that, you know, nobody really finds out that. So that's sort of, you know, that was my MO. It continues to be my MO. Harvard was a very different place when I came. So I came in July of 2005, and I got tenure in January of 2009. So in July of 2005, it was a very different place, even though it seems like just the other day. Larry Summers was the president of Harvard, and he had told me, because he's an economist, I knew Larry, he had told me in a conference that my paper was so bad at the conference that I should destroy the computer that it had been written on. So I'm now working at the institution whose president has already told me that my work is not particularly very good. When I was being recruited to the Kennedy School, the academic dean told me, as part of the interview, he said, I strongly urge you to rent and not own. So that was the second thing that I was told. So we didn't have forums like this. We didn't have Judy Singer, you know, sort of. There was no acknowledgement of One Harvard. So just in the past 8 years, just during the time that I have been here, it is a very different institution from the one that I saw when I came in 2005. And so things are really awesome right now. So anyhow, so what is it that I know today that I didn't know back then? What I didn't fully appreciate back then was Harvard loves to hire, promote, and tenure stars. And what that means is, at least what it meant for me as an economist was, it was not okay simply to have 6, 10, 15 excellent papers in excellent journals. That was not good enough. I had to be amongst the world's best or second best persons at what I did. So I study productivity growth and technology growth in healthcare, and I had to be basically number 2 to Alan Garber in that space. And it didn't matter that I was sort of this dilettante and had all this big portfolio of papers where, you know, today I study healthcare and tomorrow I study criminology and day after tomorrow I study teacher cheating. That didn't matter. I needed to be the expert in healthcare, or the expert in education, or the expert in nuclear security. I didn't fully appreciate that, but that's important because now I see the tenure process from the other side. And one of the questions that we always find ourselves asking ourselves is, you know, let's not evaluate this person's papers as the sum of their parts. Let's actually ask, in this field, where does this person rank? So how would you know? So the question I ask myself then is, now that I know this, how would you know that you've picked a field that's, on the one hand, it has to be important enough. On the other hand, if it's too important, well, there's going to be a lot of competition in that field. So you want to pick an area that's sort of sufficiently crappy that you can add a lot of value to it, but not too narrow. Because if it's too narrow, I mean, if you're sort of the world's foremost economist on the balance of payments crisis in Latvia, Harvard is unlikely to give you tenure because that's a sign that you've just sort of, you know, it's a little too small. But you don't want to be the world's best economist on balance of payments crises because that's too big. Now you're competing with a lot of, you know, luminaries. So how would you know? So the rule of thumb that I have used when I give people advice is, ask yourself if there's anybody in the greater Boston area who does what you do. and this is probably a good rule for economists, if there isn't someone in the greater Boston area, and you think about the 40-something universities around here that does what I do, it's probably way too boutique and narrow an area. So there's got to be someone that you can be compared to. And the more I share this with other people, they say, yeah, maybe you can change the scope of, maybe it should be in the United States and maybe not in greater Boston, but there has to be at least 5 or 6 other people who essentially do what you do, which is another way of saying, don't be the world's biggest expert on the balance of payment crisis in Latvia. Don't be the world's biggest expert on goblins, leprechauns, and trolls in 18th century Germanic literature, unless that happens to be a particularly thriving area of Germanic literature. So I think that was kind of the first thing that I know now that I didn't know then was this importance on stars, where stardom is measured not necessarily by the length of one's CV, but really have you taught us something? Have you taught this sub-area of your discipline, history, economics, philosophy, something that we didn't know? The second thing that I learned was being a professor and all the challenges that Jennifer and Francesca talked about is very different than being like a very busy person who works for a venture capital fund or at an investment bank. Those guys work even longer hours than we do, but there's a fundamental difference in what they do and what we do. They have one master, and we have multiple masters. So to your point, Jennifer is dealing with the book publisher. She's dealing with her chair of the department. She's dealing with the dean's office. She's dealing with her students. And they're not all talking to each other on how much work Jennifer is doing. And that's not true if you're a cardiologist working 80 hours a week, because if you're a cardiologist working 80 hours a week, you still answer to the Brigham and Women's Hospital. If you are an investment banker working 70 hours a week, you still answer to Citibank. So there's an employer who's internalizing these multiple tasks that you're asked to do, and that's not true in our job. We have to do the management ourselves. And it seems like a very obvious answer, but that's what makes our job profoundly difficult, because our multiple masters are just not coordinating the demands on our time. So I spend a lot of time in Washington. I have a lot of demands on my time from Washington, but I don't get to take the demands on my time from Washington back to Harvard and say, gee, look at all this work that I'm doing in Washington. Similarly, I don't get to tell Washington, well, you know what, I'm teaching a class tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, because they don't care. So I think we have to figure out, how to manage the multiple masters. And I don't think there's a formula for this, but I think one thing that was very helpful for me when I came to Harvard was I think of it, I'm pulling in an analogy from the business world. It's good to have like a board of advisors, a 3-person board of advisors. And you probably don't want to call it that, but just think of it as a 3-person board of advisors. And I think who you want on this board of advisors are 3 people. One of them is someone in your department, so someone who sort of maybe not do what you do, but is intimately familiar with the politics and culture of your department. You want someone else at Harvard who does what you do, but who's not in your department. So in my case, it would be find another health economist who's not at the Kennedy School, who's perhaps at the medical school or at the School of Public Health or at the law school. So someone who can kind of read my papers, tell me how I'm managing my career, understands Harvard, but is not trying to solve all the local problems of my teaching schedule. And the third person you want on your board of advisors is someone who is in your field, but not at Harvard, but someone who understands Harvard. So ideally someone who was at Harvard, someone who would be writing letters of recommendation for a tenure case at Harvard, someone who has served on a Harvard ad hoc. So it could be, in my case, it would have been like a health economist at Princeton or a health economist at Stanford. In your case, it would be, a linguist at the University of Chicago or a political scientist at MIT. So I think if you have these 3 people to talk to, and you talk to these 3 people, say, twice a year on kind of how you're doing, you'll get a lot of feedback on whether you're managing those multiple masters well or not well. Because I don't think there's a formula to managing the multiple masters. You sort of have to talk to people all the time who'll give you a sense of whether you're putting too much weight on teaching and too little weight on writing the book or too much weight on Washington. And so I think 3, for me, 3 has certainly been the optimal number of people. The third insight is, I think, the most depressing insight, but I think it was the most powerful insight, and Jennifer and Francesca have already talked about this. Life is a zero-sum game. Every hour that I spend working and doing my job at Harvard better is an hour that I'm not doing my personal life job as well as my Harvard job. And so there are only 24 hours in a day. No matter what Harvard pays me, that is the one constraint that money cannot relax. And so there is this fundamental trade-off that you just can't get around, that every extra day in the office, every extra hour at work is an hour away from all the things that you will actually remember, when you're 85 or 95 years old. So how exactly do you manage that? And Francesca and Jennifer had some terrific suggestions on this. I sort of have more micro suggestions on it. One is, I think of my world, my life as basically managing monkeys. So I call all my projects monkeys, I call all my students monkeys, I call all my meetings, I call them monkeys. And so I think what you want to be is, you don't want to be the breeder of monkeys. What you want to learn to do is you want to manage the monkeys. And so here are some insights on how I manage the monkeys. The first lesson about the monkey management business is that monkeys need to either be fed or shot. Otherwise, they starve to death. And when they starve to death, as a well-intentioned human being, you're inclined to sort of want to resuscitate them in the end of life. And that's extremely expensive and costly. So you should have a meter that basically tells you this project is a live project or it's not. And I think we're all guilty of misunderstanding sunk costs. We spend a lot of time on kind of projects that we thought were A+ projects. They turn out to be B+ projects. If you knew it had been a B+ project to start with, you should have stopped working on it. You wouldn't have started in the first place. But as human beings, we're not economists, we're sort of behavioral economists, and so we are like, oh, well, I invested all this time and money into this project, I'll resuscitate the project. And that's an example of not feeding or shooting the monkey, it's an example of starving the monkey. So I think that is the one thing that if someone had told me, if I could just have sort of bred fewer monkeys, I would have been a lot happier. The second thing is, you have to keep the monkey population low. The arrival rate, these monkeys reproduce fast, and the arrival rate of monkeys far exceeds the departure rate of monkeys, right? It takes a project years to finish, but it takes seconds to start a new project, right? And if you remember that, you'll know that, look, I mean, I got tenure in 2009. I took a year off after tenure to sort of just kind of get my life together. I still have pre-tenure projects that I have not finished, and I work all the time. And I think kind of just acknowledging that it is not good to have 14 projects or 8 projects or 3 projects, and to do what Jennifer did. She was sort of the ultimate monkey slayer. She had her book, she had her second book, and she didn't sort of get into what I got into, which was this never-ending proliferation of papers. I mean, they were good, but they were just decimating my well-being. Okay, all right, so then finally, another piece of advice on the monkeys. You want to feed the monkeys by appointment only. And this is hard-nosed, and I think the efficiency of the schools varies by the school. So at the Kennedy School of Government, we sort of resemble government. And I think the business school sort of resembles business, and so I think the HBS is much more efficient in School of Public Health. God knows what goes on there. But I'll tell you something. I have noticed that because we're not a for-profit industry, nobody is counting the value of your time. So people think nothing of saying a seminar will last 2 hours. People think nothing of saying, I need to talk to you for an hour, or we need to have a faculty meeting for an hour. And so I realized, just in comparing Harvard's performance to other institutions' performance, that a lot of these meetings can be done in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And I think insisting on that, and insisting on an agenda before the meeting, especially when a PhD student is involved, is, again, another way of just giving you that extra time and acknowledging the zero-sum nature of what we do, right? At the end of the day, what will make us happy is sort of, I mean, yes, tenure at Harvard made me extremely happy, but at the end of my life, I think what will make me really happy are the dinner parties I have with my friends, the time I spend with my parents and girlfriend, and whether I'm caught up on Breaking Bad and Homeland. That's what sort of enters into my utility function. And I think the monkeys are really the enemies of knowledge in some sense. Like, you managing them well is difficult. And so anyhow, so I have this sort of 4-step program now for managing the monkeys, and I'm a much happier person. I just wish I had known that in 2005 when I came to Harvard. So thank you.